The following presentation is brought to you by the Museum of Mountain Flying, established to preserve for future generations the aviation heritage of America's Rocky Mountain West. Missoula's first airport, Hale Field, was bounded by South Avenue, Bancroft, 39th Street, and Russell. At 1:31 a.m. on Friday, December 18, 1936, a Northwest Airlines mail flight departed Hale Field, bound for Spokane and Seattle, Washington. The Lockheed 10A, piloted by Joe Livermore of Spokane and Arthur Haight of Seattle, did not arrive at Felts Field in Spokane. The story of this flight is told by Jack Demmons, historian for the Museum of Mountain Flying.
Bit tonight and have a kind of a program, and then go on with the business meeting after that. And ironically, one of the reasons we were going to do that is so some of the folks who like to get to bed a little bit earlier could do so, but I don't see any of them here tonight. But anyway, we'll go ahead with the program tonight. Jack wants to talk a little bit about crash sites and aircraft or mountain flying history.
One air crash. When I was a youngster living in the Bonner area, I remember my parents talking about an airliner that crashed. I never forgot that, although through the years it was in the back of my mind. But the parents were talking about a plane that went down, a Northwest Airline plane that came out of Missoula, had Christmas mail on board, and that's about the last I heard of it at the time. This was the headline in the Missoula paper. Plane that went through Missoula during the night is down somewhere in Idaho. That was December 18, 1936 on a Friday. The plane took off at 1:31 in the morning from Hale Field. The two pilots were experienced pilots. Joe Livermore of Spokane and Arthur Haight of Seattle. The ship was a Lockheed Model 10A, a real state-of-the-art aircraft. And there's a picture of one, Model 10A, the first of the Electra series. They had 450 horsepower engines, Pratt & Whitney Wasp Jr., rated at R985. But a nice ship, and they said the drum of the engines was something to behold, probably like a C-47 or a DC-3. But that's the plane that took off out of Hale Field early in the morning of December 18 with 500 pounds of mail coming from St. Paul on the way to Spokane and then Seattle, because Northwest had extended its route all the way to Seattle from St. Paul and Minneapolis. The engines, for example, this is a type Pratt & Whitney Wasp Jr. SB3s. Those were the two that were on the aircraft that headed to the west on a direct flight to Spokane from Missoula that stormy morning. The side view of the aircraft engines. Again, these are 450 horsepower. Amelia Earhart had a Model 10E that looked very much like the 10A. And she and Fred Noonan disappeared over the South Pacific on July 2, 1937. Of course, were never found trying to get to Holland Island on a round-the-world flight. But going back first a little farther to Northwest Airlines. A lot of people don't know that Charlie Dickinson, who was a seed salesman, made a lot of money selling seeds, was interested in aviation. Started an airline in the spring of 1926. He had two fatal crashes. He gave it up, and then a corporation known as Northwest Airways took over in 1926. Charles Dickinson had aircraft like this, a Laird commercial, two people in the front and a pilot in back, and they were quite an aircraft, kind of the state of the art. But that was one of the first ships that Charlie Dickinson had. And then Northwest Airway came over, and they had the first aircraft was a Detroit, or Stinson Detroiter. That was the first Northwest Airway type ship. And again, it was a good aircraft at that time. Amelia Earhart, she had ship 1055. It was lost at sea again, 7237. But you can't quite see this, but the configuration is very similar to the one of the Model 10A. Well, after the ship left Missoula, the pilots were in touch with the Phelps Field. They ran into a storm, and they found out later on they were probably off course. Direct flight line is about 175 from Missoula to Spokane to Phelps Field. And somewhere over here, they got off course. The wind, I guess, blew them off course. They were in trouble with the compass. And they were seen over Beauville to the south of St. Mary's. In fact, one fellow said they came over their place 100 feet in the air. They were headed to the southeast towards Elk River. Not Elk City now, that's way farther south and to the east, but Elk River. They saw a glow in the ground. And what happened was that the potlatch lumber sheds were burning, were on fire, and so they circled that area for a full hour. And the word got to Spokane that the aircraft was circling, and they called Livermore and Haid and said, "You're over Elk City," so they headed on back to the northwest to try to get on the radio beam. They were seen and heard over the railroad. Of course, in those days on the St. Joe River, the Milwaukee Railroad ran right alongside the river. Some of us had traveled that route. It was quite a scenic route in those days. But the plane went back. He contacted Phelps Field, that is Livermore, at 3 a.m., said he was back on the radio beam. He contacted him again at 3:19 and said they were heading on course, would call at 3:24. Yes. At 3:24, and the call came in approximately 3:24, loaded with static, and that was the last call that ever came from this aircraft. Put down perhaps this is what happened. We don't know, actually, because no one around Avery, Idaho ever reported the aircraft. But perhaps it was something like this. Perhaps it came down this way, because they're definitely at Beauville, Elk River, and then swung back to the north. And nothing was heard from them for about 4 days. And then 116th Observation Squadron at Phelps Field had been alerted. And pilots Cooper and Harnett were airborne with observers. And they found that nothing was seen. Bob Johnson, Dick Johnson, and also Penn Stowe were involved in their search. And then on the day, it was about the 21st, Hartnett found the aircraft. It was on a ridge, and he thought it was Cemetery Ridge. That would be down right about over in here. And said they almost cleared the ridge by 300 feet, but they were just short. The wings had come off, and the aircraft was strewn along the top like a bunch of tin cans. It was a high-speed crash. That airplane could travel about 107 or 180 miles an hour. When they finally found the bodies, the wristwatch on Livermore's wrist had stopped at 3:24 a.m. on that Monday morning. So just after the last contact when the plane went in. Now up here at Cemetery Ridge, about 2 miles south of the air crash, it had been erroneously reported as the site. However, Cemetery Ridge was a place where in the fire of 1910, 18 men burned to death in Big Creek, and they were buried on Cemetery Ridge. Later, they were disinterred and taken down to St. Mary's with 36 from Sutter farther up towards Avery, and they're all buried in a big circle down there at St. Mary's, Idaho. Have any of you seen that burial site? It's quite a sight. Drop in there someday. So it wasn't Cemetery Ridge. They finally got to the bodies on the 28th, to the plane. They didn't find the bodies at first. And then one fellow was walking along, there was a hand sticking up in the air out of the snow, like asking for help. And there's one of the pilots. They were still strapped in their seats, and of course frozen to death. They had a difficult time getting them on toboggan. The Spokane Ski Club came up because Livermore was a part of that club. Bought toboggans and took them on down towards Calder, Idaho. Actually, Herrick first, the old logging campsite, and then to Calder, and put the bodies on the Milwaukee train. Livermore was sent to Spokane and Haig to Seattle. Haig's wife was in the hospital with an 8-day-old baby, daughter at the time. They didn't tell her what had happened for a while. Thought they just told her that he was on another flight. They had to get and that was it. Livermore had a 10-year-old daughter. But it's a strange thing. I talked to Thomas McCabe down here at Calder this summer. He has a part of that wreckage, a piston. As far as we know, the wreckage is still up there. There's a rough jeep trail to it. He says, if I can get over there, he'll take me up on horseback to the site. But right near the ridge, on the south side, is where the wreckage is strewn. 300 feet more, and he'd be on the ridge where you look down towards Kellogg or towards the St. Joe. Is that close to the divide? But again, there's weather, of course, on the compass, and other things that transpired. The actual crash site again, Cemetery Ridge, about 2 miles south. It's up in section 23 in the northeast corner at the head of Early Creek. Here we have Big Creek, which the fire 1910 went through. In fact, it went through most of that area. Kellogg's about 15 miles north of the crash site over the ridge. It wasn't the fault of the aircraft, actually. I mean, a proven aircraft that could cruise at 10,000 feet, 180 miles an hour, could fly in one engine up to 6,000 feet without any trouble. Again, the state-of-the-art of aircraft at that time. You have any questions up to that point? Have any of you ever heard about that plane before? Most people haven't. 1936, that's a long time ago. Right. I think a good part of it is still up there. This is the headlines again on the 21st. Pilot searcher discovers what he thinks is wreck of Northwest Airlines ship. They're quite sure both men were dead by that time, of course. Here's a picture of the aircraft tail section. NC 14935, after they uncovered it several days after locating the aircraft and finding the bodies which were thrown out of the aircraft like in that B-17 up out of Superior. And it was one of the early models of the Model 10A. I don't have that down here right now, which one? I think it's number 55. Anyway, it was NC 14935, Model 1024. It was the 24th model of the Model 10A. They didn't start with number 1, they started with 1,000. So this was 1,024, the 24th ship that was built in the Model 10A series. And of course, we have Electras flying today, you know. Johnson had 2. They kept going through the years of different models. One day we'll talk about Nick Mamer on Model 14 that crashed out of Bozeman when the whole tail section came off and the Northwest Airlines crashed and killed everybody on board it too.
How many passengers were there?
8. And it's a good point on the, let's see here, 8 on that, and you could carry, for example, a DC-3 could handle 28 people. They both flew around 180 miles an hour. They could both cruise at 10,000 feet without any trouble. And they built 13,500 DC-3s and C-47s. They built 998 of the Model L-10s. Of course, the Pratt & Whitney engines on the DC-3 were much bigger. They were 1,200 horsepower, whereas these had 450. And the first airline to take the Model 10A was Northwest. The first one that got the DC-3 was American Airlines back in 1936. One final thing about this is a sequel to this. In Idaho, in the area that we're talking about, down below Superior and heading over into Clearwater, at this time there was a fellow named Bill Moreland called the Ridge Runner. Have you heard of him? The Ridge Runner? There's a book on him. He was in that area at the time that plane flew over. He went into the wilderness in 1932 and did not set foot in a settlement until 1945, 13 years later. He existed by stealing from the Forest Service, from the ranger districts, from the lookouts. Then the Forest Service got upset because he was leaving the top off the pipes. He didn't know who he was. The snow was getting in, but then when he started taking the candles around inside and it was dripping on the floor, they really got irritated and they really set out after him. And they captured him in February of 1945. They put him in the insane asylum at Orofino twice. He escaped once, then started working. They thought maybe he wasn't that dangerous. He escaped in 1963. He was seen walking towards Pierce, Idaho by Altmaier, who was an old logger, who was a friend of his. It was the last time anyone saw him at the age of 63. He was born in 1900. He'd be 95 years of age today, but Bill Moreland's ghost is still out there, and I've talked to people in Superior, and they've seen him too. Up on Hoodoo Pass, checking down, and also at Saltese. But that's Wild Bill Moreland, and it's quite a story, folks. 13 years he never set foot in any community. And walked around, he stole a 22 rifle. He had all kinds of rags on when they found him, and when they captured him, he stood 5'2", weighed 130 pounds. Came out of Kentucky. He'd been in jail a couple of times for minor incidents, not very serious ones. Got picked up in Seattle for riding a freight train during the years of the Depression. But that was that one. And also over the area in Marble Creek, and I've walked the Marble Creek country looking for logging history, the old steam donkeys that are 40-ton Willamettes. They stand about 20 feet tall. They're down in Hobo Creek and Cornwall Creek, and the old abandoned logging locomotive in Lion Creek. And I went through there in the summer days a few years ago in the heat of the summer, old abandoned trestles. And in that area, there's a ghost by the name of French Louis, and he drowned in 1904 in Marble Creek. He came down. I came down there one night about 10 o'clock after coming out of that deep canyon in Hobo Creek, and they told me where to look for him. And there he was across that fallen snag. He had a peavey over his shoulder. He walked out towards the river, and Marble Creek's big, and he walked back into the gloom and disappeared. But French Louis was down there too when that airplane went over. So there's a lot of history, folks, behind that Marble Creek country of logging, mining, death, murder, and intrigue. And no one lives in the Marble Creek area now. No one. You have any question about the aircraft that went through here in the night, December 18, out of Hale Field?
I have a question about your 20-foot mule.
A 20-foot what?
A 20-foot mule?
Oh, they're logging steam donkeys.
Oh, it's not a mule.
No. I'll have to show you. I've got pictures of them. I found the one in Cornwall Creek. It was coming up. I couldn't find it. It's down in the canyon. I hadn't put the trail in. I got up a rise, and there it was in front of me. 65-foot long skids on that. And the machine is still sitting there with all the drums and the cable, 2-inch cable. They had 6,000 feet of cable on those steam donkeys. But a lot of that stuff is still lying around over there in the woods of Idaho. But you can't take it out. The Forest Service says we're going to stay there as a monument. So, and they're doing a pretty good job on those steam donkeys. Okay, that's just a little bit of history relates to Missoula.
You said that Ken Sr. and who else were involved in the search?
Bob and Dick Johnson were both mentioned in Missoulian as being involved in the search for the aircraft.
Probably, from what I know about Johnson Company, they did it on their own nickel too, or did they have any search and rescue funds in those days? Or they probably
I don't think so.
donated their time.
I don't know. It didn't say. I've got the article somewhere too I can let you have on that, so I don't know. And by the way, Bill Moreland was, Dick Johnson searched for him by the Forest Service was hiring him, and Moreland was scared to death about airplanes. He knew they were looking for him. He said, those planes go over there, I should have shot them. But he never shot at him, but he'd hide every time a plane came over. But Dick Johnson was up there trying to find him. Okay, that's all I had.
Flying the Big Sky, A History of Montana Aviation from 1897 through 1946 is presented by Dr. Ann Milbrook for the July 1996 meeting of the Museum of Mountain Flying.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Can you gentlemen in the back all hear me all right? Okay. They're at least nodding, so I assume they can hear me. As Stan mentioned, I came to Montana as a National Science Foundation visiting professor at MSU in Bozeman, and thought since I had 2 years in Montana, I'd like to do an article on something about Montana. And given that I've worked extensively in the history of aviation, I thought I'd see if there was enough aviation in Montana to do an article on. And in very short order, I realized that I was writing a book on the history of aviation in Montana. And the slideshow tonight will be some snapshots of my work in progress, of what I'm discovering. And I'm still doing research and still writing. But right now, my history of aviation in Montana begins in 1897, 6 years before the Wright brothers flew. A couple businessmen in Chicago were proposing to transport would-be miners to the Klondike goldfields via flying machines that would take off from atop a mountain in Montana. They didn't name the mountain, and trying to figure out why they would need a mountaintop, I decided, well, it is 6 years before the Wright brothers. Maybe they thought they could glide halfway there. But my real suspicion is that these were just some city folks trying to raise funds from other city folks and didn't know Montana. On the more serious side of aviation, we have airplanes in Montana in 1910. Browns sometimes claims the first flight. A few other places claim first flights. Is that in focus?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm so close I can't tell. And the first flyers around Montana were actually a group of people from the Curtiss Exhibition Company in New York, makers of the Curtiss aircraft. This is a photograph I found in the archives in Bozeman, and it says the first airplane in Twin Bridges, Montana, 1900. Well, it's a Curtiss pusher. You can tell that. One, the props are behind the pilot. You know it's a pusher. You know it's a Curtiss because it has ailerons, whereas all the Wright planes had wing warping. Instead of having a surface, an aileron that moved, the Wrights literally would, through the rigging, bend the wing, warp the wing to get an aileron effect. And that's basically the big patent dispute in the earliest 20th century on the invention of the airplane, was between the Wrights and Curtiss on who invented the airplane and whether or not the ailerons was a separate invention not covered by the Wright patent so that Curtiss could make his fortune. Turns out, I can even tell you the name of the pilot. This is Cromwell Dixon. He had pilot's license number 48. Now, there were no pilot's licenses in the United States for airplane pilots until 1910, when the Aero Club of America started issuing licenses. No one was required to get a license. However, if you wanted to get paid for doing air shows and exhibitions, you needed a license. And so most of the early people with pilot licenses had them from the Aero Club of America and were stunt and exhibition pilots. Now this is Cromwell Dixon, and here's another view of Cromwell Dixon in his Curtiss pusher. 1911, this one is in Helena, when he attracted international attention to Montana, when he became the first person to fly an airplane across the Continental Divide. He flew from the State Fair in Helena, from the fairgrounds, to Blasberg, 17 miles to the other side of the Continental Divide. Now I hear a little giggling. You won't giggle as much when you find out. He won a $10,000 prize that had been offered for the first pilot to cross the Continental Divide. Now 10,000 doesn't sound like too much. We'd all take it. But you convert $10,000 of 1911 money into current money, and you have $160,000, which is what he won for flying across the Continental Divide. Why did he do it? Why was there a $10,000 prize? John Ringling of circus fame, after whom Ringling, Montana is named. Lewis Hale, railroad fame. Lewis Penwick, land developer in Montana, put up the money to get advertising for Montana and to get Montana in the news. And when Cromwell Dixon crossed the Continental Divide, the telegraph in Blasberg telegraphed New York City, and he made the international press for Montana, promoting Montana and the current technology, new technology of the day. Whoops, I got to go the other way. Now, not all the early flyers were men. This is Catherine Stenson, 1913 at the Montana State Fair. She was one of 4 Stenson pilots, 2 brothers and 2 sisters. The 2 brothers and the sisters ran the Stenson Flying School down in Texas, very famous flying school. But like most businesses, they needed capital, and that was Catherine's job. She raised capital for the company by being a stunt flyer. And she came to Montana and again made national history. For the Montana State Fair of 1913, she was federally authorized to carry U.S. airmail, the first female pilot to carry U.S. airmail. And she carried the mail from the fairgrounds outside of Helena to downtown Helena. Sorry, this works reverse of the one I have at home. A biplane, how's that?
Twin prop.
To a twin prop biplane pusher. I don't see any ailerons, that might be a right. This is another view of her plane. And I should mention that after her famous performance in Montana, she went on a tour of the Orient, China, Japan, and at one show in Tokyo, more than 25,000 people came to see her do her stunts. And that's basically what flying in Montana was before World War I. But we get World War I. And then Montana becomes very interesting. We get Montanans impatient with the fact that we're not in the war, being patriotic, going to Canada and joining the Royal Canadian Air Force, or going to Britain and joining the British Air Force. Now, they're kind of hard to document, because if you join the Air Force of a foreign country, you swear allegiance to the foreign country and you lose your U.S. citizenship. So most of the Americans who joined the Canadian and British Air Force used phony names. That makes it very hard for us historians to track. However, the French Foreign Legion does not require you to swear allegiance to France. You only swear allegiance to the French Foreign Legion. So we are able to document conclusively that 2 Montana boys joined the French Foreign Legion Flying Corps, the Lafayette Corps. And this is Austin Parker of Helena, one of those 2 lads. and the only one to survive the war. Now, Austin Parker was a newspaper man in Helena who was about to change businesses. He wanted to go into theater management, so he was on a boat to China to study theater management in China. This is true, folks. I couldn't make this up. But he decided China wasn't the place to go with the war in Europe. So he diverted and got a boat down to Panama, and he didn't want to go through the Panama Canal. That was old hat by this time. So he hiked the Isthmus of Panama. And while hiking through the Isthmus of Panama, a German plantation owner imprisoned him on the plantation. Again, true story. Aston Parker bribed some natives into smuggling him a carved-out canoe, and he escaped at night, paddling down, and made it to the Atlantic side of the Isthmus of Panama, caught a boat to France, and joined the French Foreign Legion Flying Corps. Trained in 3 different flying schools in France, flew Newport, Spads, all the French-made planes, a few British-made planes. As a sergeant, the rank of a pilot at that time, he served on the German front with 2 different French squadrons. Now, one of those squadrons had 6 American pilots and 9 French pilots. And one of those American pilots, who was a roommate of Austin Parker's, happened to write home. And yes, I found the letter. Not easy to do. But his roommate wrote home about what it was like to fly for the French Foreign Legion in World War I. Quote, "We have absolutely no duties but flying, and no discipline except to be there when we are wanted to fly." Not a bad job. Now, after the United States entered World War I, Parker transferred to the U.S. Naval Air Service and was stationed in Italy. The U.S. had a real shortage of airplanes, so he was assigned to an Italian squadron where he flew the Italian Machi bomber seaplane on the Austrian front. And then later returned at the end of the war. The other American had joined the French Foreign Legion, had just started his training. He didn't have his wings yet when the U.S. entered the war. He transferred to the U.S. Army Air Arm and died in a training accident. Now, after the war, we have war surplus equipment, and that's when flying becomes much more common in Montana. You not only have war surplus equipment, you have war-trained pilots. Now, when the U.S. entered the war, Senator Myers of Montana had helped pass the Army Aviation Bill that provided $17 million to build up an Army Air Force for our effort in the war. And within 1 month of that bill passing, more than 100 Montana residents had enlisted in the U.S. Air Service. And after the war, these people are coming back trained to fly. This was not a Montana native. This is Charles Lindbergh. And he was in Montana in 1922, barnstorming. And he took a job at Westover's Garage in Billings when the barnstorming outfit he was with folded and left him broke. And he wrote in his diary about working in Billings, quote, "As a night attendant, sitting up in the dusty garage office, playing an old phonograph to pass the time, selling gasoline to an occasional traveler in the dark." He worked the night shift in part because Bob Westover let him fly his airplane during the day. And he did wing walking and parachuting over Billings. And this is Lindbergh in 1927 after his famous flight non-stop across the Atlantic. Now that was the purpose of the flight, non-stop across the Atlantic. Solo was not a requirement, because this was a prize competition, just like crossing the Continental Divide. This was the Ortiz Prize, $25,000, which there's a mathematical formula you can convert today to $215,000, compared to $160,000 that Cromwell-Dixon won for a 17-mile flight. That is how much aviation had developed over the years, that a 17-mile flight could win almost as much a prize money as crossing the Atlantic non-stop. Oh, by the way, I forgot to mention, when Cromwell-Dixon won this huge fortune, he then went to the next fair on his schedule, which was in Spokane, the interstate fair, where he crashed and died. A very rich, dead man. This gentleman is one of the pilots trained during World War I by the military. It's Art Stephenson with his Waco 9, Miss Dillon. He moved to Montana after the war and promoted aviation any way he could, including becoming a Waco dealer in Montana, including doing a charter service, later becoming an airline pilot. Federal government starts getting into aviation in 1925 with the Airmail Act, allowing the federal government to contract out the carrying of airmail instead of having postal pilots carry the airmail. And in 1926, it passed the Air Commerce Act, which further encourages the organization of commercial airlines. Commercial airlines don't reach Montana until 1928. In 1927, the most famous comedian in America, Will Rogers, comes to Montana. And he's used to performing in Europe, where they have commercial airline service. And he likes to fly from engagement to engagement. So he hires Art Stephenson. He arrives by train in Missoula, hires Art Stephenson to fly him to Helena and Great Falls and Billings for his performances. This is another view of Stephenson and his plane. And Will Rogers wrote what it was like to fly in Montana in 1927. Oh, wait a minute. I want to point out, Stephenson sat in the back seat, which was conventional for the pilots. The paying passenger always sat in the front seat so that the oil off the engine would not blind the pilot. Will Rogers wrote, quote, "We flew everywhere, would stay all night in the town I had just played, get a good night's rest, take my time about getting out in the morning, have a nice breakfast, and then we would leave just whenever we wanted to. Didn't have to have Mr. Northern Pacific make up your mind for you. Fly over the beautiful mountain tops, and in 2 or 3 hours catch up with the train that had left the night before. See it struggling up some old crooked grade and through tunnels, and we would just sail right on." Airmail and commercial aviation does reach Montana in 1928, first coming out of Salt Lake City north to a terminus in Great Falls. With the Federal Airmail Act and the encouragement of carrying airmail and the encouragement of carrying passengers, you have companies designing airplanes for the first time for carrying mail and passengers. This is a Boeing 40B, which is identical to the 40A, except it's got a little bigger Hornet engine instead of a Wasp engine. It's a 2-passenger airplane. The passengers are in an enclosed cabin. closed cabins first came on in this country, many pilots didn't want them, thought they were unsafe. If you couldn't listen to the wind going through the wires, how would you know how close you were to a stall? You have to remember, stall horns come in the 50s and 60s. And part of their skill in flying was how well they could listen to the wind, the relative wind blowing across their plane. And they didn't want to be in a cabin. They didn't think it was safe. In some of the early cabin planes, like the Boeing mail plane, the pilot still sat outside. Okay, another form of commercial aviation. This community is very familiar, I trust, with the fact that it has very rich smoke jumping history. The fact is, aviation and forestry in Missouri, as near as I can document, goes back to 1918. The war's over. What are you going to do with all the military pilots and planes? After all, you want the Army Air Corps to keep some of those planes and pilots flying. Well, one of the proposals was to use Army pilots and planes for aerial spotting of forest fires. And Missouri in 1918 was a finalist in the competition to get the Army Air Service aerial patrol, fire patrol, here in Missouri. However, Hamp Arnold was in California, and the project went to California. The Forest Service does start using airplanes based here in Missouri in 1931. This particular slide is June 1932 at the Bartlett Creek Landing Field in the Flathead National Park. But in 1931, the Forest Service decides to experiment with carrying freight by airplane instead of pack horse into the woods. And in 1931, they delivered over 100,000 pounds of freight by airplane from Missouri to different grass strips in the wilderness areas, carrying everything from fresh eggs to the workers out there to prefabricated buildings and stuff by airplane. The contract price was 5.5 cents a pound, which resulted in a ton-mile cost of $1.83. Now, those numbers, unless you're in that business, may not mean a lot, but compare them to the pack horse prices of the previous year, and you find out that using airplanes saved the Forest Service 33% per ton mile. And from that first year on, the Forest Service is using airplanes for freight, and then in the late 30s getting into the smoke jumping. Now, what's happening in Montana is a part of what's happening nationally. And in 1934, there is a major aviation scandal. Both houses of Congress are investigating. The Justice Department is investigating. The White House has appointed investigators. And all the airmail contracts are canceled. Temporarily, the Army flies the airmail. And the entire aviation industry is reorganized. What Congress had discovered was that the aviation companies were operating very profitably and within the law. But profitably, too profitably. So they changed the law. They discovered no one had broken any laws. But if Congress subsidizes the carrying of the airmail and guarantees that every airplane that carries airmail on a flight makes a profit, and the company that's carrying that airmail bought its airplane from a sister company within the same corporation, and bought its propeller from another company within the same corporation, and bought its engines from another company within the same corporation, and every one of those sister companies also made sure they made a profit, that Congress was not just subsidizing airmail and passenger travel, they were subsidizing the entire manufacturing industry and aviation. And so they changed the rules. If you wanted a federal contract to carry airmail, you could not manufacture any equipment. So this is when the big conglomerates in aviation break up. United Aircraft and Transport Corporation, for example, was one of the three biggies. There, Boeing took all manufacturing west of the Mississippi and put it in a company called Boeing. And he was so fed up with these hearings and stuff that he then retired. But he put his name on a company, so he's still famous. Now, his East Coast partner, Fred Rentschler, took all manufacturing east of the Mississippi and put it in a company called United Aircraft Corporation, which currently goes by the name United Technologies. Now, all the airlines that their predecessor company had owned joined together in Chicago under the name United Airlines. The immediate impact in Montana to this 1934 reorganization is Northwest Airways, which was flying an east-west route from Chicago to Seattle through Montana, becomes Northwest Airlines. The Depression is what really brings federal money to Montana aviation. This is the West Yellowstone Airport in the 1930s, built with work relief money. 80% of the federal funds paid for labor, 20% went for supplies. Airport construction in the 1930s was not very mechanized. Even if they had tractors and plows, they probably wouldn't have used them because the federal money specified labor. This is a National Parks 247 plane taking off from the brand new airport. I'm not sure that's ready for me to take off from, but at that time it was open for commercial service. It was park season. The Works Progress Administration, the Civil Works Administration, and the Public Works Administration, the PWA, the WPA, the CPA, and the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, were all work relief programs that put Montana residents to work building airports. Spotted Bear was one that was built by the CCC. Most of them were WPA and PWA projects. This is another view of the West Yellowstone Airport. Since the previous one made it look a little primitive, this shows you that it was a nice modern mountain airport. The 247, by the way, in many history books is the first modern airliner. It's all metal, it's two-engine. It's smaller than the trimotors that it's replacing, noticeably smaller. But it seats 10 passengers and it goes 50 to 70 miles faster than the trimotors. With the two engines, rather than three, with the faster speed, seating 10 people, this was the way of the future. And the trimotors the 247s are operated by National Parks Airlines, which was headquartered in Butte, which was the aviation capital of Montana in the early and mid-30s, from 34 to 37. Whereas Northwest Airlines, doing the east-west route instead of coming up to Montana from the south, was getting the Lockheed 10 Electras, another modern 10-seat, two-engine metal airliner. This is 247 south of Butte. Whitehall's in the background. This is on its way to Butte, which I said was the aviation capital. There's a major airline headquartered there, a regional airline, National Parks Airlines. The only federally approved repair center in Montana is in Butte, run by National Parks Airlines. It was approved for welded steel tube structures, for wood structures, for fabric coverings, for steel fittings, for instruments. It was not approved for laminated wing spars, nor propellers, nor any aluminum fittings. Just so you get an idea of what was going on there. Also, Butte had the only federal radio communication center in Montana in 1934-35, was in Butte. It broadcast the 4-course radio range instead of the Omni range we use today. The Omni range has 360 radios coming out. The 4-course radio had 4 beams coming out. The radio was for the commercial airlines. Out of all the planes registered in Montana in 1934, only 4 had radios, and only 2 of those radios could send information. It was for the airlines that the federal government was building the radio stations and the other airway aids. And they were building lights. We still have flashing light beacons. The state of Montana maintains 17 of them. But that was a nationwide federally funded program. And when those were initially built, they not only had the flashing light telling you there's a beacon there, they had a course light, a red course light that shone down the course. A pilot could fly visual, in contact with a red line below him all night long, without seeing the ground or anything else, but be legal for visual flying with a red course light. They positioned them so that you could go on the airmail routes. However, being the Depression and being Montana turned its lights off at 10 o'clock to save money. And the positioning of the lights was coordinated with the rural electrification so that they could get electric power to them. They occasionally used gas generators, but they tried to coordinate spreading electricity across Montana with building airways. After all, you're building a future. And by the way, 1934 is the first year that a pilot can get an instrument rating. Instead of just getting a transport or commercial or private pilot license, you could actually start getting a commercial rating. This is an airplane that landed in Twin Bridges in 1937. No, there was not an airport in Twin Bridges in 1937 for commercial flights. This was a flight that was on its route from Seattle to Salt Lake City. Its route did not include going over Montana. But over Idaho, it went into a blizzard. And when the guy came out of the blizzard, he landed next to the railroad tracks in Twin Bridges, found out not only where he was, but that on the ground it was then minus 54 degrees. There were some problems with early flight by instrument. Some of that work's public relief money went to fancier facilities in the West Yellowstone. This is Great Falls. The buildings were constructed with WPA money. First Works Progress Administration, and then after Congress killed the Works Progress Administration, the WPA reappears as a Works Projects Administration. Same staff and everything else, but a new name so Congress could take credit for killing an agency. But these are federally funded construction, not only of the runways, of the drainage system, but of the buildings. Okay, that's another view of Great Falls. How much impact did federal funds have on Montana aviation in the New Deal? January 1933, Roosevelt's just coming into office. So it's pre-New Deal. This is the start. Montana had 70 aircraft in the state, based in the state. 38 of them were licensed. Montana also had 5 gliders. Interestingly, Montana had 101 airplane pilots and no glider pilots. I think that might have been a statistical fluke on how they collected their data. However, 1933, of the 101 pilots living in Montana, 32 were transport airline pilots because National Parks was headquartered in Butte until 1937. Also in 1933, Montana has 41 airports. Now, December 1938, the end of the New Deal, because 1939 we're into war preparedness, a different era in history. December 1938, we have 82 airplanes based in the state, up from 70. We have 1 glider, down from 5. We have 114 airplane pilots, up from 101. We have 1 glider pilot, up from, which now makes sense, 1 glider and 1 glider pilot. However, of those 114 airplane pilots, only 1 is a commercial airline pilot, because National Parks had left the state. We do have 34 commercial pilots, people like Art Stephenson, who are doing charter work, people like Nick Namer, who I forgot to mention. He was the one with that Force Service contract in 31. In 1938, December, we have 74 airports, up from 41. Not only do we have 74 airports in the state, we have 18 of them with lights. None in 33. And the New Deal programs for work relief turn into war preparedness programs. So the construction and the improvement of airports continues non-stop until the United States is in the war. Another thing that happens is a high school program in Helena starts to expand as this threat of war is on the nation. A vocational ed program goes into the Helena School of Aeronautics, which remains a high school program through the war. Training students, in the words of the director of the program, quote, for export. Training students to get jobs at Boeing. This is the Helena School of Aeronautics in 1944. One of the rooms, that's the dope room at the school. Now, the faculty of this high school program also did the military aviator training, ground school training at Carroll College, which had a Navy contract for training naval air cadets. Butte had a naval contract. Bozeman, the college there, had an Army contract. Missoula, I believe, was an Army contract. But the high school faculty taught, and that's the machine shop at the high school. And the students doing machine shop work could get a full wartime salary because the high school got contracts from Pointer Willimatic, a company that was building military trailers in Billings during the war, And they also got contracts from the Puget Sound Naval Yard, so that they were doing real work in their training program. In preparation for war, the Army Air Corps surveyed sites around the nation for possible expansion, construction of new airfields. Can anyone tell me where this Montana military air base is? This is Cut Bank. An Army air base constructed in 1942. Another one was constructed in Lewiston, another one in Glasgow. Those were satellite bases from a major base built in Great Falls. Now, but first there was a survey to see what sites were appropriate for the Army's needs. Based on the survey of Montana, the Sites Board concluded, quote, Missoula was not favorably considered because of topography and meteorological reasons. The Missoula site is in a depression surrounded by mountains close enough to the site to represent a hazard to flying operations. The weather conditions there are notoriously bad. Now I mentioned the 3 satellite bases, and as you can see, it's a full-size base for training B-17 bomber crews. 4 crews were trained here at Cut Bank, 4 at Glasgow, 4 at Lewiston, and another 4 squadrons in Great Falls. However, in 1943, the Army closes Cut Bank, Glasgow, and Lewiston air bases that were constructed at a cost of $11 million within 1 year, and considered closing Maelstroms, which was then simply called East Base or Great Falls. Why? Construction failures. The runways failed. You've got no heavy military planes on runways built in a rush at a time when there's a shortage of labor, a shortage of equipment to build runways. You're using a new construction technique, concrete runways, in a cold weather climate, and we had massive failures in Montana. Now, it's not just the weather, of course, because there were a few failures elsewhere in the nation, but the highest rate of failures was in what they called the Missouri River District of the Corps of Engineers. And that was part of the problem. Less than a year before these bases were built, it was the Quartermaster Corps that built air bases. And they had transferred the duties to the Corps of Engineers. So you've got a new bunch of supervision, and you've got a bunch of supervision in the Missouri River District that was used to dams, not airfields. You've got a major labor shortage that's compounded in Montana by the fact they're building the Alaska Highway. And men and equipment are being diverted for constructing the military road to Alaska. And you have massive failures of the runway. 3 bases are abandoned. There's a reason why Great Falls was not abandoned. But that reason was secret until 1945. And this is the Great Falls East Base. There's an East Base and a West Base. East Base is east of Great Falls. West Base is west of Great Falls. West Base is Gore Field. It's the municipal airport, which the Army took over during the war, while it was constructing East Base and as an overflow because they were doing so much activity in Great Falls during the war. And what was that activity? It wasn't training anymore. It was supplying our Soviet allies, man-lease, ferrying aircrafts to Fairbanks, Alaska, where we'd turn them over to Soviet pilots who would fly them over the Siberian air route for use on the German front. It was very important to the United States to keep the Soviet Union in the war so that Germany would have 2 fronts. Supplies across the North Atlantic, convoys were susceptible to weather and submarine and other attacks. The route across North Africa was subject to sandstorms. The Persian Gulf route, whether it was approached by boat or from North Africa, usually involved disassembling the aircraft and reassembling them in Persia before sending them on to Russia. So Great Falls was a major way to get airplanes to our Soviet allies. Okay, this is the operations hangar at Great Falls during the war. Bombers, fighter planes, cargo planes all went through Great Falls. They were flown by the WASP, by the women pilots, from the factories to modification centers for winterization, or directly to Great Falls for winterization here, and prepared for shipment to Alaska. And they were ferried to Alaska by the 7th Ferrying Group. They did not allow women to fly into what they saw as a combat zone. And of course, there was some fighting in Alaska and stuff. So the 7th Ferrying Group took them to Fairbanks and turned them over to Soviet pilots. This is called the Twin Hangar, also at Great Falls during World War II. Some of the aircraft, there were almost 8,000 airplanes delivered, more departed than were delivered. If you understand the air route and the primitive condition between Great Falls and Fairbanks at this time, one of the rationales for building the military road to Alaska, the Alaska Highway, was that if you built the road, then you could put emergency landing fields next to it and get gas and supplies and things to planes that were forced down. P-63s, P-39s, A-20s, the B-25s, the C-47s were the major planes that were shipped. Often these planes left Great Falls packed to the gills with sealed diplomatic cases of industrial and military information. Some left Great Falls carrying nuclear samples to help the Soviet bomb program. Some of it went legally, some of it falls under the category, in the opinion of Congress, as espionage. But they figured as long as the planes were going, no use having them go empty. And this is the transient aircraft hangar at Great Falls. Civilian aircraft production had been suspended in 1942, and civilian planes were ordered to be disabled or parked at a military guarded airport. You had your choice. You could disable your aircraft so that no saboteur could come and fly it, or you could park it at an airport that had adequate security to guarantee that no saboteur would get it. Or you could bow to government pressure and sell your airplane to the government so that it could lease it to have a flying program set up in the civilian pilot training program to train pilots for war service. And so there was a real shortage of airplanes. This is 1946. Helena is getting a delivery of post-war airplanes, the Cessna. The Western dealer in Cessna dealer and distributor in Helena in 1946 sold 130 Cessnas. Those are the 120 and 140 models, both the new all-metal Cessnas. The 120 was considered ideal for training purposes. It had no starter, no generator, no flaps, perfect for students. The Stetson dealer in Helena that same year sold 48 four-seat Stetsons. Now the Stinson dealer and the Cessna dealer in Helena that year were the same people. It had to be two companies because of the way you get your dealerships. But that Bill Farmer and Charles McCharles, and Charles McCharles is still living up in Great Falls. In that 1 year, they sold 178 airplanes in Montana. In that same year, Taylor Craft and Piper were doing a booming business in Montana. And that's the same year the Flying Farmers and Ranchers formally organized in Montana. However, it was a short-lived boom. It was a one-year boom. Now, Farrer and McCharles were really smart. They did this booming business in 1946, and they sold all their aviation businesses effective 1 January 1947. The Cessna dealership went to Lynch in Belgrade, and later in 47, Lynch moved its headquarters to Billings. They sold the Stinson dealership to Morrison in Helena, and they sold the Sky Supply parts business they had to Bob Johnson in Missoula. And from then on, the private aviation business has been in varying degrees of depression or recession. But they did have one glorious year. I can't imagine someone selling 178 airplanes in Montana in 1 year. This is a 1942 aeronautical chart of western Montana. You can see the 4-course radio ranges. And this slide allows me to use my favorite quote from Stick and Rudder, a great book on flying. Out west, where men are men, and aeronautical charts are a solid brown. The pilot is subject to the laws of thin air. And in summer, in the west, air thinned out still more by heat. And I'm a student pilot, and the FAA requires me to quit when the sun goes down. So I thank you. I'm happy to take questions or comments. Like I said, this is work in progress for a book. I've been investigating the CIA's involvement in shutting down the Johnson Flying Service. And I just last week in Billings discovered that the CIA was active here in Missoula from the 1950s, not just in closing Johnson, but in some other activities. And I'm looking at the commercial airlines and private flying, and if any of you have any information, please give me a call, come up and see me. But first, are there any questions?
Carmen, you were talking about the runways.
Yes.
And I think it's pretty well known or surmised now that our nuclear Russian nuclear espionage all went through Great Falls up over Siberia.
The early stuff all went through Great Falls, but a lot of what historians initially called espionage wasn't espionage. It was so important to keep the Soviets in the war, and the Soviets were constantly in danger of quitting. And you wonder why? Stop and think. Out of all of the people killed during World War II, over a half of them were Russians. They were taking a terrible beating. And it was a top priority to keep them in the war. And Hopkins, the head of Lend-Lease, ordered the Manhattan Project to release not only technical information, but nuclear materials and stuff to the Soviets. Some of it was espionage, most of it was legal during the war, when the flights were going out of Great Falls. Now, after the war, it all turns to espionage, and we do have a case of a spy being arrested in Great Falls, in about 1954, and he confesses and talks about how he was recruited when he was on assignment in Europe, but his Great Falls assignment did not include any sensitive information, so he pleaded guilty to espionage on stuff he had done in Europe. But interestingly, he mentions the bar girls in the bars that served the airfield. And some of them were agents he had met when he was stationed in Germany. Anyone else? Yes, sir.
Speaking of early dealers in 1946, the dealer of this airport in 46 was Veronica, and they were started by Bob King, and then later sold to Jess Olin, called Missoula Aerial Service. They sold a lot of airplanes here. By 7, they saturated the market, and that was about the end of it.
Yeah, I can remember.
Then with the train, put them together on Phillips Street, walk in and fly them off the street out here and land them at the airport. I don't know how many we took off over there.
Okay. That truck I had showed you, the delivery truck, actually had 6 Cessnas in that one truck that were then assembled in Helena for sale.
Came in on the Northern Pacific and they put together in the backyard, rolling out here.
Okay. Well, ladies and gentlemen, one more?
When do you plan to have your book out? Any idea? Do you have a rough goal?
If I can spend next month home writing up all the stuff I've been finding, I spent the last month mostly over in the Billings area doing research, and I need to incorporate that. I hope to have 3 chapters polished enough to start circulating to publishers so that when I'm done with the entire manuscript by the end of the year, I'll have a publisher. That's my optimistic hope. I have a number of publishers interested, but none of them are financially or time-wise in a hurry. And since I'm currently unemployed, I would like to see this lead to something soon.
You plan to use pictures?
Yes, and that's basically the selection of slides are things I'm finding and collecting along the way. And I'm going to Billings Monday. I have borrowed pictures from the Logan Airport, from Ken Raleigh, who once was a manager here, and then manager out there, and his wife Marge. Her father is the Dick Logan after whom the Logan Airport is named. Borrowed some pictures from them, and also borrowed some pictures from Lynch Aviation, and all of those are being copied, and I'll pick them up next week. And so if I give this slideshow a month from now, it's going to have some other slides in it, just depending upon what I have and stuff. I had recently bought a couple slides from the Ohio Historical Society on Cromwell Dixon, paid $50 for 2 pictures and slides of them, and they're such poor quality they're not usable. But Cromwell Dixon was an Ohio native, and he learned to fly in dirigibles and then switched to airplanes. And when he got his license number 45, he legally and legitimately billed himself as the world's youngest aviator, because at 18 he was the youngest man to have a license in this country. Of course, there were only 45 people with licenses, so. All right, there are a few extra handouts if anyone wants to take extra as they leave.
Anybody wants